Next up, we have Dr. Darinka Cziske. She is an associate professor in housing management from the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at Delft University. And she will be giving us a talk today about the collaborative housing. So welcome and a big applause.
Thank you very much. I think you can start. I can do that myself, yes? The green one, okay. Yeah, okay. Again, that's me, indeed. Well, I would like to start by thanking our host of the day, Tina de Moor and her wonderful team, for this amazing opportunity to share knowledge and not only celebrate her big day, but also bring us together to, well, hopefully start new collaborations. And what I'm going to be talking about is really, well, from the world of platforms and the so-called sharing economy, we're going to talk about the real homes for real people who are, unfortunately, in very much need for a different housing system. So I start my research, which I've been carrying out for the last 8 years. Before I was doing research, I was research director of a think tank based in Brussels about social housing, and I learned a lot about how housing is provided in different countries in Europe. But one of the things I discovered, especially when I was at the end of my PhD, was that housing systems and the institutions that are supposed to provide housing for the population are increasingly failing to meet new demands. So society is changing, and what we see is that we have systems that are very, very much old-fashioned in many ways, and what I propose is to look at housing in a different way, in a way which is more collaborative, and hence the term collaborative housing. So this is happening all over Europe. Here in the Netherlands, we have, as most of you might be familiar with, a long-standing housing crisis, which has led to, well, the government to call for an agenda of what they call 1 million homes, and it's very much focused on a quantitative solution of the problem. So this is what I call the conventional housing systems, and it's basically systems that are large scale. They aim to produce a lot of mass housing for a given type of household, a very traditional type of household, and they're very top down, and as I say, it assumes that there is a standard consumer. However, we have that the reality tells us that these systems are increasingly unable to give answers to a changing type of demand and also to increasing inequality in the housing market, particularly between the older generations who were asset holders and had good pensions to rely on, and the new generations, which in some countries have been called generation rent. So they're basically going from one rental apartment to the next, sharing by necessity, so not sharing by intention, for instance, and thereby the formation of their families is being postponed, and that creates a number of social problems. We also have a mounting care crisis in this country in particular, but also all over the advanced demographic nations, let's say, where the aging is going very fast. And well, the energy problem is something that we're facing day to day. No matter what type of housing, we need to retrofit our housing. We need to adopt more sustainable consumption patterns in our homes, construction and consumption patterns. Then society is changing in terms of the type of households. As I mentioned before, there is this outdated notion in the housing market and also in many policies that the market should provide for a standard type of family. And we see today that households are becoming more and more diverse with different family compositions. We have more and more people living alone. And the housing stock is not matching that demand. This also leads us to the issue of increasing loneliness in society, which is affecting not only older people, but also very much the young. And I wanted to go more in depth into the last topic of loneliness and also living alone, because we see that in a lot of advanced societies, the percentage of people living alone is quite remarkable compared to the other types of households, and it is rising. The trend is on the rise. We see that in the Netherlands, the average number of people living alone might seem rather small. However, if we zoom in to the data, we see that if we take the 6 largest cities in the Netherlands, this percentage goes up to match the European or the US trend. Furthermore, data from the Statistic Office of the Netherlands shows us that the trend for the last 20 or more years, and the continuing trend is expected to be a rise in the number of total households living alone, but also if we look at the composition in terms of age groups, is going to match the trend towards aging societies. So we have increasing numbers of elderly people living alone and facing loneliness, which is the negative experience of living alone. Now, what does this have to do with collaboration and housing? Well, we can act. So collective action can be taken and is being taken by people who see this as a mounting problem in society. If it affects themselves, but they also feel that it's unfair, and the government should be doing more. So you see that there are a number of initiatives, some international, also the Won protest a couple of years ago in the Netherlands, and it continues to be an issue. This is what I called a response from the side of activism. So activism as collective action, or the other way around. However, we also see that some of the same people who are protesting, calling for change, they're also engaged in doing something. This is what I call collective self-provision. So collective action as actually something propositive, something constructive, literally speaking and metaphorically speaking. So I choose to see this not as one or the other, but as 2 sides of the same coin. You can be an activist and you can also do something about it. Or you can not take part in protests, but you can be part of a group and start your own project, collective housing projects. And there are many of them, and there are increasing numbers of these initiatives in the Netherlands and in Europe. And this is what I studied for the last 8 years. I told you I started studying institutions, how housing associations or market providers work to provide housing for different groups. I realized, especially in 2008, with the global financial crisis and the ensuing housing crisis, that these institutions were unable increasingly to answer to these demands. However, as I said, we have a number of people doing it with each other, by themselves, and for themselves. And this is what we call collaborative housing. So basically, collaborative housing is an umbrella term that we use to encompass all these different initiatives. And there are some common characteristics that define what we call collaborative housing. First of all, and I would like to stress this because unlike the examples from the sharing economy, notably Airbnb, this is a whole different way of sharing. This is bottom-up. It starts from the people who are actually going to live there in the long term, and it's intentional. You don't share because you need to. You share because you want to make it part of your life. And this is radically different. The group has a common vision, and there's always a degree of sharing of practices, activities, or self-organization in these projects to make the project happen, and then once the people move in, they engage in social and organizational activities together, forming teams, committees, etc. And they also, of course, share spaces. There's a high level of end-user involvement, so residents are involved in the whole process of their housing production. And all of this leads to collective decision-making, which in itself is a very, very difficult thing. Because imagine if, as an architect, for instance, you have a client which is a family, or you have a client which is a housing association who wants you to design a new building for social tenants. Well, the architect or the builder, the developer has to deal with one client. However, in these projects, the professionals working with the group have to deal with 40 families, 50 families, sometimes, well, more or less than that. And that poses incredible challenges to the professional cultures of those building and developing homes. So it really flips the way our housing professionals are taught. And we see that collaborative living forms is nothing new. We've had, at least for over 100 years, if not before, people coming together to co-produce their own living environments, their own homes. And there are different models that, if we just take the global north, so to speak, in the last 100 years or more, we see that there are a number of different approaches to this, and there's also periods of up and downs. And in this timeline, we see, for instance, that the cooperative model, housing cooperatives, have been a long-standing and very resilient model. However, there's been tendencies sometimes towards institutionalization. So cooperatives become more like mainstream companies, and they tend to lose their original ethos. Now, in the 2000s, we see that in many parts of Europe, there's a reemergence of cooperatives with the values of solidarity, collective ownership, mutual help. So it's a very dynamic sector. We also have community land trusts, which is a model that originated in the US, actually, in the 60s. And it's also a very interesting model because it has changed and been adapted and adopted in different contexts, notably recently in Europe. Co-housing is a model originated in Denmark in the 80s, which was transported to the US and termed co-housing. And again, it's a model that is very much focused on generating bonds between the people who live there. And well, I already talked about this, but this is just to clarify what distinguishes collaborative housing from conventional housing. So we have a very schematic let's say, classification of if we want housing today, how is this produced? So basically, the standard customer is assumed to be the heterosexual nuclear family. We have a man, a woman, and their kids. And they would aspire to own their own home. So who provides this home? Either they're self-built, if there is a country with a culture of self-built, like in the US, for instance, not so much in Europe, or there is a developer who builds a whole new neighborhood in a kind of cookie-cutter way, usually, to minimize costs. The notion of efficiency that Irene presented earlier, we also see it in the housing system, and creates these homogeneous neighborhoods that we don't really like very much because not much happens there, right? And then you have the rental sector. And the rental sector differs very much in different countries. But overall, you have that the rental tenure tends to be transitional. So for people who are young, who are starting their working lives, their personal lives, and they need a place to stay while they form a family and move to their longer-term house. So here we have, for instance, a sharing of a flat, a house, in a short-term way, by necessity, and usually this is not part of a common project. However, if you look at collaborative housing on the far right end of the slide, then we see that collaborative living means a longer-term commitment, and it's an intentional endeavor with a common vision, which requires collaboration. And we see that there are many, many different forms of collaborative living today in Europe. This is research we have done for a few years now with my team. And it's an incremental project. We call it the collab mapping, where we gather available data that is comparable across Europe on all these different forms. And we involved in the research the users, so in an attempt to do a bit of citizen science, also to do it differently. We said we want to learn from them. How does our definition of collaborative housing make sense to you in your country? Yes, no? What elements do fit the models that you see in your country? And how do you call it in your original language? We see the original labels on the right. And well, long story short, we came up with these categories that would allow us to do some comparative analysis across countries and over time. So yeah, why do people engage in collaborative housing? We've also done a lot of research on motivations, and overall we see that there are long-standing motivations that, well, were at the beginning of these forms, and they're still true, notably community life, and this is also very important if we look back at the original diagnosis I presented. What's wrong with our current housing systems? Well, there's a lot of people suffering alone, not living the way they would like to live, and in very, very a weak situation socially. So there's also gender equality as a driver, because when you live as a group, very often you're able to spread the domestic work and thereby liberating time for the people who traditionally take care of these chores. The environmental agenda is also leading a lot of eco-villages, circular projects of housing that are being led today by people who think differently and they want to live more sustainably than what is offered by the market. As I said, aging and care are also big drivers of senior co-housing and other types of models that are focused on the elderly. For instance, in the Netherlands, we have the Knarrenhof. There's a long waiting list for that type of living. You can live intergenerationally, or you can live with other senior people, like in Sweden, where they pioneered in the 80s already the second half of life, seniors-only projects. And affordability and social inclusion are more recent drivers. And I would argue these have come up very strongly with the so-called housing crisis, which is, in my opinion, not a housing crisis, because it's been going on for decades. It's really a structural deficiency of our housing provision systems to give answers to this number of differences in how we want to live. Now, the collaborative element comes into play when we look at how the group of residents who are basically amateurs, they are not professionals in terms of providing housing, they have to interact constructively with a number of other professionals and institutions. They have to go to the bank to get a loan, a group loan for that matter. And as we know from the current situation of the wooncoöperatie model in the Netherlands, it is extremely difficult to get Dutch banks to fund these projects, because there's not such a culture of trusting groups of citizens to do things together. Least so provide housing for themselves. Whereas if you go to German-speaking countries like Germany, this is standard business for them. There are banks who actually specialize in giving loans to groups because they know that they pay. They are very compliant because their home is the most important asset. So they will be responsible. So it's a whole cultural mindset that is very different. The same goes for the planning officers. I mean, the planning systems are extremely diverse. And in this country, they are not designed to allow for collective buildings like this, where people share things, they share spaces, they share responsibilities. Everything is individualized. So imagine how challenging it is for groups who want to engage in these forms of living to get their plans approved. They need to work often with architects. Sometimes the architect is also a resident, which poses a lot of challenges, how to establish a boundary. But we have a lot of interesting accounts from people taking part in these projects and being also a resident. And then they have to get on with each other. And there's a lot of examples of projects that have fallen through because people just argue and the group is disbanded. Well, I already mentioned this. We need a new professional mindset, and I call this a paradigm change in the construction industry from participation, so basically consult and inform the user, to really turn them into co-producers, give them an equal voice. And this is my last slide. So I started my talk by saying, well, the ways in which we provide housing today is not fit for purpose. So how could it change? My proposal is to introduce collaborative principles in mainstream housing provision. And how can we do this? Well, think, instead of mass production and technocratic efficiency only, think more about empowering people on a local level to create custom-built and long-term thinking in how we want our cities to look, our housing to look 50 years from now. Think also more in terms of co-production, involving citizens who are willing to be part of this. Give them a serious stake in the matter. And think definitely that society is changing, and therefore our housing needs to change. Give more space for what one of my former speakers called the community economy. Well, the community economy. There are so many other ways to think about housing, not just in a short-term, profitable way. And I'm not only talking about developers, I'm also talking about us. In our choice to become a homeowner, are we thinking about a home, or are we also thinking about an investment? often we do both, because we operate within this system, the neoliberal capitalist system. And well, last but not least, as researchers, let's also think about a different way to do research on this topic. And this is what I'm trying to do, just as Tina and other colleagues, right? We are trying to stop researching subjects, but do citizen science and research with them. Thank you.